Hey, welcome back to the 167, where I'm here with Andrew Baja Blast.
That's what they call me.
That's
He is the Baja
Baja
Blast.
Blast Zero.
who is they?
Hey.
That's his street name, is the Blast.
Yeah.
And Pastor Rick George.
Oh, yes, they call me the.
What?
No,
He had a song.
yeah,
I know. I
it's an old
desperately
song.
need
That's
you to
the
finish
closest
that.
I've ever been to having my own theme song.
That's a bad song. I don't know why that just came into my mind.
Oh, okay.
I
Never
didn't-
mind. Stricken from the record.
yes.
Pastor Lucas Miley, the discipleship pastor. And we started a new series this week called I Feel Stuck. Which
We did. Yeah.
I found fascinating, like at least the early part of the sermon where you described what that actually meant to be stuck. And so I have a very awkward question for us to start with. And if you are listening to this podcast, we want you to put your own maybe in the comments if it's not too embarrassing for you. But you described it as being in an uncomfortable and scary position. So my question is, when was the last time that you were in, or just a time that you were in an uncomfortable or scary position? Like yoga class, where you're like, oh, this is uncomfortable.
The last thing I can remember, we were working on doing some things on my motorcycle. I was just laying on the garage floor, and when you're working on a car, pretty much any construction or maintenance or mechanical thing, you can't just reach in and do what you need to do.
Right.
So I was laying on the garage floor, had to tweak my back, crank your neck around, reach around, stick my hand, trying to get my fingers up in this little place, and then squeezing it through there. Then it felt like now I can't get my hand, like it went in, and then trying to get it out.
It's like one of those gorilla traps.
Yeah, so it's a little scary and uncomfortable because the older you get, then like when you reach too far, you get a Charlie horse or a cramp, and then
Well, the minute you said I had to
it's-
tweak my back, I was like, I felt that in my bones.
yeah. So yeah, it seems like any time I'm working, we just replaced some toilets in the house, and working on a toilet, it is scary and uncomfortable.
Well, when you texted these questions ahead of time, because we do prepare.
We do.
Don't spoil it.
Sorry to
You
break the
get
third
the questions.
wall. Oh, so well, maybe at least I do. Maybe I'm just so.
You guys are getting paid.
Maybe I'm just so hyper spiritual, but I didn't take this question as like a physical. That is probably more fun for the actual podcast. I thought of like a time that I was uncomfortable or just kind of.
No, hang with me. I'm
Yeah.
going to be like half and half. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Because I would say, this marks the year length that I've been here at New Life. And
Happy anniversary!
Yeah, thank
Happy
you.
anniversary! Happy anniversary! Happy anniversary!
Hey, another theme song. But so to me, where I came from, I was there for 10 years. It was a great place. I didn't have any problems. I didn't have any reasons that I needed to leave or necessarily even wanted to, but I felt like God was really saying, I got something new for you. I have something very different. And to me, it was just uncomfortable to even have that first conversation with you on the phone, even though it went scary well. I thought, oh my gosh, God's really, he's going to make something happen here. And that's scary to me. That's uncomfortable after being in one place. But for the record, I'm glad he did.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of an interesting thing too, because it's like putting your first step out. I think sometimes is maybe the scariest thing like that, where it's like having that initial phone call, because it's like, if this does go well, I have to move, I have to have other conversations and all those
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
I was thinking same thing, but kind of it was career and ministry wise is I've shared this story with you before. The first ministry I ever took right out of college. So this church came and they asked me to come minister in Missouri. And so I went there, and I kid you not, like the job was, you're going to be the youth pastor. And that really included birth to college. And I was like, whoa. It's like church about 500 people. And they're like, no, 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 it's fine. We have a children's pastor, and she works for you. She's part time. She handles birth up to fourth grade or fifth grade or whatever it was. And I was like, great. And so I showed up the first day. I moved all my stuff. I had a truck full of stuff. It was literally parked outside my apartment. I had signed a lease. I got everything. My first Sunday, while they were announcing me, apparently it had been discovered that her husband was having an affair, and the deacons were going to confront him. And he was on the worship team. He skipped out mid-service because he knew it was going to happen, took off, and they have her in the conference room, and she's having basically a mental breakdown because they're, explaining this to her that her husband's been having an affair. And so basically day one, they were like, yeah, you're going to have to take this whole shebang. And it was like, she's freaking out. We can't, we feel bad because, they wanted to keep paying her because it was a bad situation.
Nice.
They trying to help her out. So I couldn't hire anybody. So I was like, in retrospect, I'm always going, should I have just left? Should I have just been like, no, sorry, I'm out. But I'm like, I had signed a lease. I had all, my stuff is ready to be unpacked in the U-Haul. I'm like, this is not at all what I signed up for. And there was that moment where I'm just going, I don't even know what to do other than to just stay and kind of muscle it out of this. So it was a really nerve-wracking experience to be in your first full-time ministry. And day one, they're like, we're completely changing the terms of this. And I have already moved in.
Yeah, relationally, when you're in those uncomfortable positions, some people thrive in that chaos or that tension. I'm not one of those people. I just feel like I can tell my face is turning red, and my hand this is really awkward. Somebody needs to say something, or, oh, look at the time. I probably should leave. And yeah, it's, when you know that something has to be said or done and you're in that position, yeah, it can get really awkward. And you're just stuck there. And you're like, I can't just get up and leave.
So you like stuff?
Yeah.
Well, I love what you were talking about, that so you went through kind of these 4 phases, and I think these are so true, which is it starts as an uncomfortable feeling. So you're in a position and you start to go, I don't know about this. This feels kind of scary or weird or awkward. And then you said it moves to an irrational thought. So it moves from this is awkward to they probably hate my guts. Yeah. That's why they're not talking to me. It moves to an unhealthy action and then a painful consequence. So I almost thought about that because I have teenage girls, and of course they're, a little crazy right now. But I think back to all those things, just little things where it'd be you'd be in high school and there'd be a girl that you like, and it's you're sitting next to her and she won't look at you, and you're like, oh no, she hates me. And then it moves to an unhealthy action, which is you'd say something dumb, you'd say something stupid, and then all of a sudden she's giving you this look, and I'm like, oh, now she really doesn't like me.
You had a chance until then.
Yeah, that loop, even though we can identify it, it's so hard to get out of it. And I don't know,
especially when you're in it.
Yeah. So with you guys, you can speak to this, but how quickly the irrational thoughts start to come into your process of thinking, and they don't seem irrational. When you're in the middle of it, they seem very real and logical, but from the outside, it's why? What took you to that place where you had that thought? Right? And it's irrational. Sometimes we do, we know that it's irrational. We know it, but you can't stop it. So it's those irrational thoughts that are devastating to us, and that just pushes us into that acting part.
Well, and I think we all know that, like you said, we have to break the cycle. But I was curious for you guys, when you're looking at those different stages of that cycle, what do you think breaks you out of maybe each one of those things? So if you had to pick one, what do you think is it irrational thought, is an unhealthy action, painful consequence? What is the thing, that moment of repentance, or I have to break this cycle? What can you do to get out of each one of those areas?
Well, I would say, when you teach someone how to drive, so what are you have kids that are learning how to drive?
Oh, yes, I do.
So you wouldn't take them straight to a busy intersection, straight to a highway, say, go. that's your first encounter with driving, that would be a bad idea. That means you're in it. It's life and death. There's craziness, chaos. You take them to a empty parking lot. You take them to a safe place. You take them to a place where they're not in the craziness. So that is something that I have to think about intentionally, where, like we said, when we're in it, when we're in the middle of that cycle, it's going to be unlikely that you can just overcome everything and conquer the moment and come out on top, and not, if that's the pattern that you're used to. So when you have your regular quiet time with the Lord, when you have your regular study, when you have your regular spiritual conversations with wise people that you trust, when you're not in those moments, I would say that's the moment that you say, okay, now I have time. Now I'm in a safe place. I can think, I can ask the Lord for guidance. I can look to his word. I can talk to people that I trust. I'm not in the thick of that moment. Now I can really, really think about it, ask God to help me, and make a plan, or maybe identify how I'm doing those things in those moments, and ask God to help me form a plan of attack for when they come back.
Yeah, I can just tell you like what I do, whether it works for everyone or if it's the best solution. I just come to understand, for me, like I have feelings, like I feel things. Everyone has feelings. Okay, backtrack. In our culture, feelings now are rising to the top of the food chain, so they become the most important part of who you are. Okay? I don't feel like it's the most important part of who I am. I have them. I recognize them. Okay? So I have these feelings. Where I get off track personally is in that process, in that step between what I feel and what I think. That's where I start to get off the rails. So when my thinking becomes irrational, illogical, or unbiblical, or whatever, it's not right, that's when things start to spiral down. So for me, what I have to do is go back and check my thinking. Right? So Zig Ziglar, one time said, hey, what everyone needs is a good checkup from the neck up. Right? So to do that checkup in your thinking, your thought process.
So when you're doing that, when you're looking for that checkup, do you kind of run it by somebody in your life? Like, what are you doing to kind of, because if I have that irrational thought, it's kind of hard for me to get outside and recognize that my own thought is irrational.
Yeah. So what I typically do is, I've talked about it, it seems cliche, it's simple to understand, difficult to do, is I go back to Philippians, where it says the things that are right and true and honorable. So what I say to myself, like in this, when I start to have thoughts, is that true? Is that a true statement? Is that is it a right thought? Is it a pure thought? Is it a thought that is pleasing to God? And it requires discipline. And I don't do it well. Like I still get off the rails, and then it takes somebody else to say, why are you thinking that? Or why are you doing what you're doing? Well, it's because I thought this, and then I have to backtrack.
And it's funny on that too, because if you start from emotion, you can actually make rational decisions, but it's based on that foundation of emotion, and it's an irrational foundation that now you're making logical steps from.
Yeah. So for me, that loop, what is necessary for me to get out of that dysfunctional loop is to hit the brakes and to address the irrational thoughts, and just to make sure that they're true and they're pure and they're right and they're lovely, and those Philippians 4.
Yeah. I think when I always look at things, what I've started to tell myself in my head, especially, like you said, when you deal with your children, I'm going, what story are they going to tell in 5 years? Like, is there going to be this story that they're like, yeah, I screwed up. Like, I think about this story for me it was weird and it was kind of irrational, but I actually wrecked my dad's truck. And so I was hauling a bunch of mowing equipment, got in an accident. And I remember it all very clearly because he came and he showed up and he just kind of had that disappointed dad look and he said, "You have school tomorrow?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "I'm going to get you out of school tomorrow. And I got to borrow the van." And I was like, "What?" Like he was kind of off in his own little world. I didn't ask any questions because I was so scared. And he drove me to downtown Chicago. And I was like, he's going to drop me off. This is going to be some lesson I'm going to learn. And he took me to a Cubs game. And we literally like parked at Wrigley. And I looked at him and said, "What are we doing?" And he goes, "Oh, so-and-so at the church gave me tickets to the Cubs game." And I was like, I totaled your truck. And the next day you borrowed the van and inconvenienced my mother to take me to a Cubs game. And I will never forget that. And I think that like when my kids are in trouble or something's happening, I always want to ask like, what is the story in 5 years? And I feel like that at every one of those stages, I have an uncomfortable feeling. Is that going to be a story that it's like, hey man, remember the first time we met? That was super weird. And then we just kind of broke the ice and it was great, or, if it's an irrational thought, and it was like, man, I believe this thing and I was way off, or is it an unhealthy action that has a consequence? And I'm going, is this something that I'm going to do the action and then seek forgiveness and avoid the consequence? Or is it going to be the thing where I'm in the midst of the consequence and this is going to be my story of overcoming? And I'm like, I constantly want to ask myself that question to see if I can snap myself out of it earlier, and that's not always a clear answer. If my kid does something, sometimes you need firm discipline and sometimes you need to take him to a Cubs game. But it's like, I guess I'm kind of looking at that, trying to see a future tense of it, of if I'm in that moment going, what is the story in 5 years and what do I want to tell?
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Where's this thought going to take me? Where's this action going to take me?
yeah.
What's it leading to? Because it's leading to something.
And I can't just be irrational when it's, I think this is going to be the story of how I became a
Yeah.
millionaire. It's just like, and then it's another consequence
This
after
is
another
a
consequence.
story all about how.
Exactly. I'm just like, but I like to check in on that occasionally and just go, do I need to snap out of this in a way that it's like, oh, I need to stop here and turn this towards, it's going to be a story of God making this for good. But I think breaking that cycle in each phase it's just very different. If you're already in the consequence, like that's the only way out is through.
Yeah.
But if you can avoid it back in, I have an irrational thought, that's a lot less high stakes.
Well, yeah. So when you mentioned that, so we've all had these feelings, irrational thoughts, unhealthy actions, and then we're in the middle of this painful consequence. Or maybe it's just, have you ever had a painful? Yeah. So we have
Occasionally.
okay. So
That's my mankind.
so the bad part, like the struggle of the painful consequence is it always has an uncomfortable feeling attached to it. Right? So you know that you're heading out of this consequence into a feeling. Right? So if you know that, then if you're preemptive, right, which most of the time we're not, but if we can discipline ourselves and learn how to be preemptive, then we can have our thoughts prepared for that uncomfortable feeling, and then we can break the cycle. If we're not preemptive, then it just starts again with the irrational thoughts. And then, for me, I'm just saying that's where it's that irrational thought that gets me off track, and I got to get it back in alignment.
Well, the question that I get a lot of times is about how we approach God in these issues, because, we tell people God's not a genie, but then if you're in a bad situation, you still want to go to him about it, right? Or you have an irrational thought and you want to say, God, is this from you? Is it from me? So, but when I'm feeling stuck, when I feel like I can't get out, or like in your situation, where you're like, I feel like I should be moving on, but I don't know about that. How do we go to God in those moments in not doubt? And, when people like, oh, I shouldn't question God. And I'm like, you can ask God a question.
Sure.
So what do you think is the balance in that of going to God in those moments when I feel stuck, but being respectful, or, like, how do I do that? How do I balance in that?
Yeah, questioning God versus,
Asking questions.
Asking questions
Yeah.
or questioning God, right. We see in Scripture different versions of both of those things, and we see in our lives, I think either way, questioning God or asking questions, as long as you're listening to God's truth, then that's fine. Even if you're in a moment of chaos and confusion, and you may even have, anger, you may even have those things. That's pretty natural. But if you're, there's a line that crosses into mocking God. We don't want to cross that or something like that. But if we say, Job was in a tight spot, we could say, and you could say he probably moved from asking questions to really kind of questioning, but maybe fair, and God had an answer. And
and that was one of the points in the message, that when we're stuck, we tend to question God. So in those moments when you feel stuck, being stuck initially, it's uncomfortable, it's a little scary. And so to question God or to ask questions of God, so instead of saying why, a better way is to say what. So what is it that you want from me? What am I supposed to learn here? What's the purpose of this place that I'm in? So we'll go back to Andrew, when you started with that feeling you had over the past, couple of years when you were in Marshfield. And by the way, thank you, Church of First Baptist of Marshfield. I know it was a hard time for them, right? Because when you left, and they probably had this feeling of, well, now we're kind of stuck. What do we do? But so you go back to your situation, and you feel like I'm stuck. So what do you want from me? Where are you taking me? What's the next step? And be open to that. Is it a move somewhere else? Is it developing something new where I am? Is it opening, myself up to a new way of ministry, a new position, a new whatever? Instead of why, it's what.
That's good. I think too, when you're thinking about approaching God, I always think that you can approach people in a respectful way. I know that God knows when you're angry. He knows when you're sad. So it's not a shock to him if you're like, I don't understand what's going on. I don't think that's a shock to him. I don't think that he's intimidated by that. But I think you can definitely go to him, and I agree with that. It's about listening and following. And I think that what you said is so true, that it's it is less important about why this is happening and what do I do about it. And I thought about Joseph, and where Joseph is, he's in Potiphar's house, and things are going great, and then all of a sudden there is this frankly irrational thing that happens. It's just this random thing that happens to him, and he could be sitting there looking at Potiphar going, why don't you trust me? What's happening here? And he throws him in jail, and he could go, well, now I'm in jail and I'll never get out. You could start to sink into that. He could be, change his behavior, which would just be to sit in his cell and pout and do all this stuff. But instead he sinks into whatever season he's at, and God moves him through those seasons. And Joseph doesn't know why he moves him through jail. He could have just made him Pharaoh's guy, but it's he moves him through those seasons, and each season he has to be fully present where he's at.
Yeah, and getting the answer to why doesn't resolve anything. Okay, so I could very easily, they're working on my motorcycle, and I got my hand, God, why is my hand stuck? Well, because you stuck it in that little hole. That's why.
Yeah,
but
it still doesn't get it out.
Yeah, it's so for Joseph, God, why am I in this position? Well, your brothers sold you into slavery. That's why.
What, they did that because you were prideful, and we're bow down and worship me.
But it doesn't really help.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't resolve the problem. What helps resolve it? What do I do now? What's the next step? What's the plan moving forward? That's a better question. It's not the question we want to ask. We want to know why, even though why doesn't resolve the tension. We're still stuck. We don't know what to do. We just know how we got there. Right? So how did you get stuck there? Well, because you put your head through that little hole and now you can't get it out. There you go. That's the
Through the
why.
banister rails.
And I think he does reveal later. You see the why a lot of times. If you're faithful to ask God, what do you want me to do, and then he brings you through something, then later on, a lot of times you can see the why. And it reminds me of this meme that I see going around of, I think it's Sheldon. He's like looking through a comic book, and it's like when you're trying to understand God's plan for your life, and he's reading a book, and he says, why, and he's turning the page, he's like, why, and then he's like, oh, that's why. You just see you see it play out over time if you can be patient and see God make these things clear to you. But yeah, the what maybe leads to the why later on if you're faithful to listen to God.
That's better than my meme that I thought of. I thought of one where it's this guy, and he's like, Lord, why do you give me your hardest battles? And he goes, you went to Taco Bell at 3 a.m. It's just like, I'm not doing this to you.
The why doesn't help much at all.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, is that the why might entirely be, in hindsight, nostalgic and reflective, whereas the what is more relevant and more purposeful. So the last thing I had was just asking, what are some example of God overcoming obstacles to fulfill promises? Because I think that's a lot of times where we get in these stuck things, we get irrational. It's, I feel stuck in my job, I feel stuck in my marriage, I feel stuck in these things, and it's like, I feel this way, Lord, where are you? And so I didn't know if you guys had a quick biblical example or a quick, kind of example.
Yeah, personal example for me, if you go way back, so I can give you a past way back, and I've shared this before, but when Trudy and I were on vacation with our family, I was on staff at a church in Lenexa. We went on vacation, drove to Detroit to see friends. On the way there, driving, I looked at Trudy and I said, I know this is going to sound weird, but I feel like God told me that I was going to be a senior pastor by the time I was 40. At this time, I was like 38. And she looked at me and she said, how's that going to happen? And I said, I have no idea. Okay. And we talked a little bit and then went on with our vacation. And when I returned back home, like within an hour of being back in Kansas City, I got a phone call and the wheels were in motion, and my job at that church was quickly eliminated. And I looked at Trudy during that process, and I said, remember that conversation we had? And I said, this is how.
Yeah.
So I feel like God had spoken something to me. Was it a promise? I don't know if it was a promise, but it was a word, and I knew, and I was holding on to it. And so the how we get there, I didn't know until later, but he revealed that very obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought of a biblical example of, well, and first my thought about this question is, my first tendency is to say, God and obstacles. I had like a philosophical thing with that. I was thinking an obstacle to God, that implies that he's surprised, so God is impervious to obstacles. He is the obstacle. I don't know. I had some sort of philosophical, but I get the question, and I think in our view, it's a fair question. And I think an example I can think of is, God promising in their very old age, Abraham and Sarah, to have this child, and it's going to be this big deal, and they're just waiting, and they're just, we're too old. She's laughing about it, and she lies about laughing about it. And so there's an obstacle of just a physical obstacle. God's like, I know how old you are. I don't care. I can do whatever I want. Yeah. That's an obstacle. And then even further in the story, there's more creative human obstacles. Not that God was surprised or taken off guard, but he's overcoming, just human error and still fulfilling his promise that he was always going to fulfill. But to our view, that definitely is like, you're sitting in a position like that saying, how is that going to happen at this point? And God's like, bro, I know, I can see the whole thing. Like, just trust.
Yeah. So ultimately, when there's a promise, just hang on to it. You don't have to understand it, because God will always fulfill his promise. Just make sure it's a promise.
When you said that, all I could think of is God's going to switch that thing into 4-wheel drive, and you better
Yeah.
hang on.
Yeah.
He's going to go off road on his promise. All right. Well, thanks, guys. We'll be back here next week with more from this series. I'm Stuck. We'll see you next time on the 167.